Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Continuing the Conversation, DEI and Safety Management System. This conversation is a follow-up to a webinar of the same title that Phil and I presented last month, and we'd love to know where you're logging in from. So give us a shout out in the comments. And also feel free to let us know where you are logging in from and any questions or comments that you have in relation to DEI and safety management systems. So my name is Kahlilah Guyah. I'm an environmental health and safety consultant and speaker and founder of EHS Compliance Services, Inc. We are a company that helps organizations manage compliance and implement strategies to protect workers, the environment, and corporate reputation. And we do that through management system audits and compliance audits, as well as risk assessment and EHS program implementation. So thanks, David. Hey, great to see you. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in all the way from Tampa. So I'm sure it's beautiful there this time of year. As we approach the end of the year, it's a great time to consider the goals and objectives we have for our environmental health and safety programs. And this last year has really highlighted the fact that we have an opportunity, EHS professionals, occupational health and safety professionals, to really integrate psychosocial risks into our EHS program, from the pandemic to racial and social injustices. It has really given us an opportunity to have our EHS programs be a little bit more holistic. So a few weeks ago, Phil and I had the opportunity to do a webinar entitled DEI and Safety Management Systems. And we talked about, DEI and what happens when organizations do it right. And on the flip side, what happens when they don't, when they do it not so good, and the implications to our health and safety systems when that happens. So hi, Wade, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Hi, Ronnie, great to see you as well. So Phil, thanks for joining me. So excited to have you with me today for my first, and I think it's your first too, LinkedIn Live. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll share with the audience what we plan on talking about today.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kahlilah, for inviting me to this follow-up to that webinar that we did before, and glad to be here. A little bit about my background. So I've been in the EHS industry for about 25 years, did environmental and safety regulatory consulting for a number of years, and then I was a global EHS coordinator for a large manufacturing company for about 4 to 4.5 years. Currently, I'm at VelocityEHS, which is a large EHS software company, the biggest in the world, in fact, in terms of numbers of customers and reach. And in my role here, I'm an EHS and sustainability expert. So I'm a resource for both customer-facing and public-facing things to help people understand what their obligations are, what best practices are, as well as a resource for us internally to help understand the regulatory environment, the changing field of EHS, and what some of the main issues are that people need to be aware of.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So I know that you post quite a bit about diversity, equity, inclusion. You are very active on LinkedIn in regards to that space. So can you tell us a little bit of how you got involved with diversity, equity, inclusion, and how the work that you're currently doing in this regard got started? And hi, Lauren. Thanks for joining in from Chicago. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. So a lot of it started, so there's a personal aspect to it and a professional aspect. It's always been something important to me, going way back to my late teen years and growing up and just understanding the importance of treating everybody equally and fairly. As a safety professional, I got to a point where I realized that those kinds of considerations needed to be integrated into the things that I was doing and the things I was helping the company that I was working for to do as well. I had thought of them, I think, for a while as being separate issues that there are these social justice issues and diversity issues that, diversity, if I thought of it as being involved in the company, I would think of it as something that HR did. It was about the hiring. It was about the career paths that we were hopefully giving people of all backgrounds and identities within the company. And it took a while before I saw the ways that this intersected with safety. And, the personal lesson that I had regarding people with disabilities and safety was when we were doing our emergency planning and we'd found that we had assumed that everybody was able to evacuate the building in our plans as quickly, as easily, and as easily as everybody else was. That turned out to not be true. And luckily we found out about that in a drill that we did rather than an actual fire event, which could have been disastrous. And it got me thinking about all of the other areas where diversity, equity, and inclusion intersect with safety. So currently, on LinkedIn, some of the things that I do are, one, I try to drive the messaging home that these things are all connected. A phrase I like, and I know you like too, is it's all connected. These aren't separate issues. You need to address these issues well. If you're going to do safety well, if you're going to do business well, you have to have input from everybody. You've got to have all of the ideas on the table. You've got to have buy-in from everyone in the organization. And with safety, it's especially important to make sure you're addressing the risks that all of your populations have within the workplace. And kind of related to that, on LinkedIn, I do a couple of series, like I do an I Was Wrong series, which is literally what it sounds like, where I think about things related to social justice, whether it is racism, whether it is sexism, whether it is ableism or discrimination against people who have disabilities, and think of past positions where I realized that I was wrong at one point, as a way of inviting people to consider whether they themselves might be wrong about the same things. Because one of the problems I think that is related to what we're talking about today is people sometimes are in an echo chamber. They talk to the people who agree with them already, and we need ways of bringing people into conversations that don't already agree with us. Related to that, I do a Recovering History series, which is about different aspects of history that relate to some of these issues, because part of the problem is that not everybody really understands the real history of what happened, and that is going to affect their perceptions of some of these issues.
Yes, those are great points. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks for your contribution to this community of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that integration that we are trying to make from the standpoint of safety management and health management. And that kind of highlights, some of the takeaways from the webinar that we performed. And thinking about that, I know that we shared that there are real health implications, both mental and physical, to workers when they do not have a sense of belonging, when they are not included, when we discriminate possibly in different ways in the way that we interact with the populations at our facilities. So with that in mind, what were some of the biggest takeaways from the webinar, or maybe even some things that surprised you in the comments that we gave a few weeks ago?
Yeah, so I think thinking back on the webinar and some of the feedback that we got, I think one of the things that when we got input from people who were attending, and one of the questions we asked was about one of the things that they struggled with. I think there were a number of people who, indicated about the different types of identities and how do they make sure that they're addressing all of those. I'm not sure that I would have necessarily thought that would have been one of the biggest ones that somebody reported, but it's not surprising. There are so many different aspects of personal identity, and a lot of those do intersect with safety. But I think too, the biggest takeaway for me from that, and I think the takeaway that I would hope that everybody would have, is that this is something that has to be integrated into everything that you're doing in safety. And it needs to start with getting a lot of buy-in from your workers. It needs to start with talking to them and finding out what their concerns are, because one thing we mentioned, psychosocial risk, is there's anxiety that comes when people don't feel that they're being accounted for, that their risks are not being taken into consideration when the company is creating the safety and environmental programs that they're putting into place. And that creates not only risks of injury, because of some of these things, such as not factoring in different body types, just gender dimorphism, men and women are different body sizes. PPE tends to be assigned based on the assumption that everybody's an average male in stature and body dimensions. There's direct risk of injury from that. And then there's also the mental wellness and anxiety aspect, which in turn can make injuries more likely as well, because it distracts people. It ergonomically, it creates tension, which puts you more at risk of an ergonomics injury as well. So again, all these things are connected to each other.
Absolutely. And to your point, we did do a poll during the webinar, and the question was, what aspects of DEI or the management of psychosocial risks are giving you the biggest challenge? So here's the breakdown of responses. I know you alluded to the first one at 47% was identifying all aspects of worker identity to address. So as you mentioned, I mean, diversity is a huge topic, and we are different in so many areas. So how do we encompass all of that? The second highest at 32% was starting conversations about DEI. And the third at 20% was getting leadership buy-in. So let's kind of tackle these in order. The biggest response at nearly 50% was regarding identifying all the aspects of worker identity to address in their EHS programs. So do you have any suggestions, ideas, or thoughts on that, on how folks might best identify the populations that they need to include?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a number of things that people can do. And the first thing is, I would probably set the stage for that by just inviting people to think about the areas where they think that different aspects of diversity would potentially play a significant role in safety outcomes. And I think, for me personally, like I break it down into, there's physical aspects, there's social and inclusion aspects, and there are physical aspects where, for example, if we're giving people their work instructions and training, there's a lot of different learning styles. There's a lot of different primary languages and facility with languages in the workplace because of different backgrounds. So there's so many OSHA standards. There's fire protection, there's forklift training, there's HAZCOM training, that all these standards have training components to them. And then there's the normal work instructions we have to give everybody to do. So those are all areas where differences in learning styles and comprehension, neurodiversity even, people who might be on the spectrum for autism can play a role in that. Physical differences, like we said, with PPE is one example of that. There's also differences in physical strength, and we might be making assumptions about what somebody can do physically for their job that might not be true. So the first invitation is just think in terms of being one of your own workers and how these different aspects of identity would potentially affect your own safety if you were in their shoes. And then think about the ways that you could get that information. And one of them would be, you could use surveys. A lot of people do that, where you're directly soliciting information from your workers about what do they think about how DEI is going? What are their concerns about DEI related to safety? Are there assumptions that they think maybe that management is making that they shouldn't be making? And then another aspect of that is just having very good representation on your safety team. Making sure that you're not only getting representatives of different departments, but that you are seeking out all different types of diversity on that team, so that you're not hearing from people who are exactly like you in background and in physical stature, and you're getting the differences and ideas that you really need to hear to do this well.
Right. That's great. I think also understanding your own worker population.
Yep.
And how does that compare to the population, the demographics where your facility is? And you can actually look and see, how you're doing in relation
Yeah.
to the population that is around your facility. So I love the idea of neurodiversity. I think during the webinar, I shared that one of my children was diagnosed with a reading disability. And so before my exposure to dyslexia and dysgraphia, I really had no idea that there might be people in the room during my trainings that did not really understand the slides that I put up on the board or up on the slides. So beginning to think about that in light of training, as you alluded, is so important because it directly affects whether workers are going to be competent or not.
Yeah.
Able to execute what we're asking them to. And also not feeling shame about maybe some of the things that they have to deal with that the normal quote unquote population may not. So,
Yeah, just to follow up on a couple of those things that you just said, those are both great points. I think of diversity as being like there's this world outside, your business, and you have diversity in all of these different aspects based on gender and race and neurodiversity and different degrees of physical ability. And if you're not seeing that represented in your business, then it means that something is stopping the diversity outside from getting inside. And I think that that's especially true, like you said, depending on what area you might be in and what the demographics of that area are. You should be seeing the diversity represented outside of your organization getting in. And if it's not, then you have to look at what is stopping that diversity from actually getting in. And then getting the issue that you mentioned about neurodiversity and autism. So my son, I have an 11-year-old son who was diagnosed with autism at age 3. And that actually has been one of the things that has given me some insight into how somebody that is on the spectrum might respond differently, not only in terms of what they're able to learn, but also in terms of how they would react in certain situations, because he is very sensory. He's prone to being overstimulated. If there's a lot of noise going on, a lot of confusion, that impacts him much more than it would somebody else. So now think about what if you have an emergency,
right.
And by definition, an emergency is something where a lot of things need to happen fast. A lot of things and people are going to be in motion. And what are precautions that we're taking to make sure that anybody that we might have that is neurodiverse in our workplace is going to have the support that they may need to be able to respond safely and quickly in that situation?
Absolutely. Great points. So the next thing that was a result of our survey was a question about where do you think safety professionals and others can begin these conversations within their organization? So a big population of the attendees said, hey, we're not even sure where to start. So what are your thoughts on where people can start to engage not only their leadership, but also, the frontline workers in conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially as it relates to safety management?
Yep. So this is where I think that we as EHS professionals actually have an advantage, because we are, through our role anyway, we're the ones who are always talking to, we're always going around and talking to people in different departments and work areas and finding out, how are you doing? What are your issues? Do you have everything that you need? So we're already in the position of facilitating conversations, and we're already in the position of identifying risks. And the things that we're talking about here are just different classes of risks. There's the additional risks of injury from not giving somebody the right PPE, from not taking them into account in our emergency planning, not making sure that they understand how to access an SDS given their language differences from us. But there's also the psychosocial risks, the anxieties that are created. Now, the first thing directly affects the second thing, is if people know that they're not getting the support that they need and they don't have access to the safety programs and materials like SDSs that they need to do their job safely, then those are psychosocial risks. So we are in the position of being in these conversations and being able to discuss risks, and this is just a couple more classes of risk, to then be able to show objectively to management, hey, we got these problems, and there are things here that are going to need to be improved if we're going to improve the effectiveness of our safety.
So true. I agree with you that as EHS and occupational health and safety professionals, we have such a good advantage because we're doing the risk assessments, the audits, the inspections. And if we're not doing them ourselves, then we typically have some involvement in that and definitely have insight into psychosocial risks that maybe our top level management doesn't. And like you said, presenting that objective evidence to them, like here's real numbers around what our workers are experiencing, I think makes DEI, more tangible for them. It's not this fluffy, non-measurable thing. It's actually things that we can observe during our inspections and audits. So last question in relation to our poll, what are some tips and tricks that we can use as EHS professionals, and we might have hinted at some of them already, to get leadership buy-in as far as diversity, equity, and inclusion are concerned?
So I think, first of all, that what management and leadership understand is risk. So again, getting to the point where we could frame this for them in terms of risk, I think is going to help, where we are showing them that this is not something separate. This is not something, DEI is not just something that stops once we hire somebody. It's not just part of the recruiting process. It's not just something that lives in HR and in career paths that we're giving to people. It's something that is deeply needed in terms of integration and safety. And these are the reasons why. Here's the risks that we've been able to identify that show that if we're not doing a good job identifying these things, it will adversely affect our safety. And getting their buy-in from the beginning on that is really important. Getting buy-in from all levels is important, but management sets the tone. And when you have management that is already understanding why this is important and is able to reinforce that in all of the interactions that they have with people throughout the company, then that is going to give you the best chance to model that in your culture, so that this becomes not just something that you do once in a while, but it's something ingrained in all of the things that you're doing, including all the things you're doing in safety.
That's really good. And to add to that, Phil, I think now is such a great time to begin to have these conversations. I mean, the pandemic has leveled the playing field as far as psychological implications of work. A lot of us are working from home and managing multiple things, from a personal and professional level in the same space. And even the social and racial unrest that we've experienced over the last few months, at least here in the States, it gives us an opportunity to have these conversations really naturally because everyone is experiencing the same thing. And so I think that we also have a great opportunity now to have these conversations without some of the stigma that has existed in the past, especially related to the mental health aspects, which often are very stigmatized, and folks just don't want to talk about it. But now, hey, we're all experiencing a little bit of anxiety and stress around what's happening. So it might be a really great time to begin to have those conversations without some of the extra stigma that's typically a part of those conversations.
Absolutely.
So if anybody has any questions for Phil or myself, we'd love to hear them in the chat. That would be great. And I think we have one more question I'd like to ask you within the time frame that we have here, Phil. One of the things that were discussed during the webinar, actually, we got some really good feedback from an attendee. She spoke specifically about inequities as far as working parents. I know that you have some personal experience with that, and maybe you can share some of that. But what are some other places that inequities can show up And how do they affect EHS programs? I know we've talked about a little bit of that. Maybe we can even talk about some of those inequities that might be invisible, or some of those differences that we might actually be able to see, but nonetheless have an impact on our EHS programs.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think first, this sort of dovetails from a point that you just made a moment or two ago regarding mental wellness. That I think that there is still a stigma. It's going away, but there's still a stigma in terms of people discussing mental wellness issues, where that the idea that we have is that there's this group of people who are mentally ill or mentally unwell, and they're over there. And then there are the people who are mentally fit, and they're over here. And they don't intersect. And the reality is it's a full spectrum. And we move along on that spectrum all the time. Things like what has been happening with all of the events in the outside world, like the protests, so like the election for that matter, like the pandemic that's been going on most of the year. All of these things move us day to day somewhere from along the points that we're on and travel through on that spectrum. And so understanding that is, I think, an important thing, because that could help break down that stigma. It's not us and them, it's us. At any given time, we are moving along that, and where we are today will be where we're going to be tomorrow. So we need to understand that we do need to take mental health seriously, make sure that we're giving everybody the resources that they have, because that is probably the biggest indicator that we're not good at identifying is when is everything becoming too much for somebody?
Mm-hmm.
Need more support, and we need to get better at, I think, at identifying that, because it's not one of the things that you could directly observe. You've got to infer it. You've got to ask. You've got to have the conversations with people. And, with issues with parents, that's another thing. I mean, think about everything that's been going on now. My kids have not been in a physical school since March, 7 months ago, 8 months ago. I don't know when they are going to go back to school. So people are doing all the things they're doing at work while having kids that require care. There are kids like mine that it might be special needs kids that they can't get themselves online and by themselves and just sit there and follow the instructions for the teacher. One of the parents has to be there doing that. And my wife is actually downstairs doing that with our son right now while I'm up here. So I think that everybody needs to be aware that there's avoid assumptions about what everybody's 24 hours is like. You see this thing. Sometimes I say that LinkedIn and just the world in general, but what people post, they want to be positive. It could go into some kind of times toxic positivity, where this assumption that everybody's got the same 24 hours, everybody's got the same burdens to overcome. And it isn't true. And that we need to be conscious of how we're talking about these things and leave room for other people to be able to talk to us about the real situations that they're having.
Mm-hmm. And that just reminds me of that equity versus equality pictogram that we shared during the webinar, and just that everybody has access to the field, but the access might not be the same. And just beginning to realize that in the conversations that we have, and not make assumptions, as you said, about what folks may or may not be able to get done in their 24 hours.
Yep.
So, Phil, we had one question from an attendee. I don't see any questions in the chat, but it was specific about resources that have been instrumental in your journey as far as diversity, equity, and inclusion are concerned. Maybe you can highlight, in addition to the series that you do on LinkedIn, are there any other specific resources that have been helpful to you on this journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, first of all, there's a book that I would recommend it's just about diversity in general, but it's a good primer. It's called Dirty Diversity by Janice Gassam. She writes for a number of publications and does diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting. I would also recommend that people look up on LinkedIn Teresa Robinson, who has also written books on many different aspects of DEI, and is posts very often on LinkedIn, and is always very has a lot of very important things to say and very enlightening things to say. So I think it starts with just look for people that are on LinkedIn. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of people out there doing this work. A lot of them post very often, and a number of them have resources that you could purchase from them, and also that you could contract them to actually do consulting for you in the event that you need it. Because, and the reality is, in the situation that we're in now, demand for their work is unstable, to say the least. I mean, there was, I think, an uptick after some of the events earlier in the year, like George Floyd and the protests that happened there. But we are still in a pandemic. There are lockdowns going on. So find ways to not only engage with these people and their insights, but to support them as well.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Phil, for your time. I know that folks can get in contact with you on LinkedIn as well as via email, and the same goes for me. I'm going to post our contact information now, but that ends our time together on LinkedIn Live, but feel free to connect with either Phil and I here on LinkedIn. Thanks so much.
Thank you.